And then you just hit capture on this when you want to.
Yeah.
Where's that?
Well, what's happening here? This is, all right, we're live now.
Right here. But we don't have to record until you're ready. Or do you want to just roll now?
No, we can wait till 7:30. You got 2 minutes. You almost become cynical after a while because so many people say, "Oh, I'll be there," and then they don't. For a while, I even used to use a sort of a negative psychology that anybody who said they were coming meant that they weren't.
Trust me, I know the feeling. A lot of people do that to me.
All right, let's start. Oh yeah, all right. The wheel is turning. Welcome. This is beginning of a new year, and this is about the 4th or 5th year in this class, which is called Astrology, Psychology, and Mysticism. And this is meant to be an advanced astrology course. But when you hear the word advanced, it means in the amount of technical material. The content should always be as deep as it can be at any level. So advanced is like a relative term. I am not, as astrologers go, I am not a highly technical astrologer. There are some things that do all sorts, some astrologers that do all sorts of technical things that I wouldn't dream of doing. What I'm interested in is getting at things in character in order to help people to understand their character so that they can live in harmony with their character and improve where it's necessary. And I take the technical part. Hey, Jay.
Hi. I didn't know they weren't working on the belt line. Excuse me, Scott.
I only go into the technical part of astrology to get at what I want to get at. Now, this course is preceded by 3 other courses. The most elementary of them being a course called Topics in Astrology. And Topics in Astrology is a general introduction. It introduces people to the signs, the houses, the planets, and the aspects. It's a fun course. The next level course is called Astrological Tools and Techniques. And that is a beginning technique course in which you learn how to read a horoscope in the most basic way possible. There's a lot of keywording, beginning with filling in the blanks, and you do things like that until you find something that strikes your intuition. And the third course is called Character Appreciation with Astrology, and it is an intermediary technique course. It goes into profiling, and it goes into estimations of the relative strengths of things, and then it looks at the 4 major facets of character: the physical personality, the emotionality, the mentality, and a combination of the individuality, spirituality, and creativity. Now, all of these are available. They're available on a website called fellowshipofthespirit.org. And if you go to the astrology section, you'll find all of them there, and it's pretty easy to get to them. But there's textbooks, so everything that you need in the way of textbooks is there. So there's no worry about that. Now, this course is as much about mysticism and it is as much about psychology as it is about astrology, because I think that it's important for astrologers to be familiar with at least some kinds of psychology, and I think it's important for everybody to be aware of their spiritual nature. That's what it's all about, and so it's going to be about all three things. The psychology that we are going to go into is what is called depth psychology. And we're mostly going to look at the psychologies of Freud and Jung. We did look a little bit into Gestaltism, and we'll look at other things along the way, but mostly it'll be the psychologies of Freud and Jung. And in this series of talks, the horoscopes that we're going to look at are the horoscopes of Freud and Jung. Hey, Jonah. The mysticism part of the class is what you might call high mysticism. High. The joke turns out to be right that way. And that is mysticism along the lines of the Rosicrucianism of Max Heindel, or the anthroposophy of Rudolf Steiner, or the theosophy of Madame Blavatsky. Now, so far, this is about the 4th or 5th year, most of what we have done has been recapitulation of the 3 courses that precede this. But it's not just simple recapitulation. It is recapitulation, but when we do each thing, when we recapitulate each thing, we recapitulate it in terms of mysticism and in terms of Freud and Jung. For example, when we recapitulated broad-based profiles, we looked at the broad-based profiles in our horoscopes, but we also looked at, for example, methods of typology. Especially we looked into Jung's typology, which is the basis of Myers-Briggs. Then we did the approximation method to find the relative strengths of each planet to each other planet, and to find the relative strengths of each aspect to every other aspect. Because what is important in character understanding is understanding the relative significance. There's the famous case that astrologers talk about from many years ago, that somebody had both a horoscope that was in danger of death by a mechanical means, and at the same time an aspect that was there as a salvation. And this was somebody who took a fall and ended up with an automobile tire within inches of his head. Meaning to say, like, he had the relative significance of the saving thing was stronger than the relative significance of the thing that indicated endangerment. And then after we did that, we did a facet study of the personality, emotionality, mentality, and spirituality of both people. And we looked at those things in terms of mysticism, and we looked at them in terms of their different psychologies. After that, we did a brief study of summary work, where we summarized everything that we had done. And then we have entered into what we are in now, which is the work of this course. The work in this course is a house-by-house study of each horoscope. First, it is a study of the house itself, so that we have the basic idea, so that from that basic idea, we can deduce the meaning or intuit the meaning as it is in a particular life. Then it will be applied to the horoscopes of Freud and Jung, and then we'll look at what it meant in their psychologies. Now, we have already done the first house, which is very early childhood as well as the physical personality. And when we did that, we looked into Freud's theories of infant polymorphous sexuality. And we looked at that whole psychology, and we had a good time doing that. And so we did something similar with Jung, but he didn't so much focus on child psychology as on adult psychology. So we have already looked at the first house. And everything that we have done is available. All of the handouts that are handed out in class, all of those are available on the website. If you go to Astrology, Psychology, and Mysticism, you can download the textbook. Now, for future handouts, I'm going to try to have them up on the website before the class starts, so that people who are viewing from a distance can be getting the same thing that we're doing right here. Now, as we look at each house in abstract, we're going to do that in a formulaic way. I always try to look back on what I have done and see where I have succeeded and where I have not succeeded. And when I introduced the nature of the ascendant in the first house last year, I didn't do a very good job of it. And so now I'm going to do it by a formula, and which means it's going to be tedious, and because it's a fairly comprehensive way of looking at each house. All right, so we're ready to go into what we're actually doing now. All the introduction is over, and there is only one introduction, because often I have an introduction after introduction after introduction. All right, our quest for this evening is to derive a general idea of the second house of the horoscope. We're not going to be complete. It's going to take 2 sessions because we are doing this, introducing this tedious methodology. The reason, again, why we're doing this is to get away from the idea that you learn astrology by reading what other astrologers think about a position. If you do that, you'll always be dependent on them, and you will not advance yourself or astrology as long as you're dependent on that. Everyone has an intuition, and everyone has the capacity of thought, so that given an idea or given a problem to solve astrologically, they can come to an intuitive understanding, and they can do that by focusing on the ideas of the different elements, like the houses that we're studying now. Now, sometimes if you don't do it this way, you might miss the true nature of an issue that's in a horoscope. But if you have an idea, you can always ponder it. Now we're going to look at the second house and every other house in a number of different ways. And the first way we're going to try to understand the second house is as a concretion of the second sign. Jerry, we're going to look at the mandala a lot tonight.
Okay.
So as it's set up here, the houses and the signs are aligned with each other, so that Taurus is the second sign, and it's in this case congruent with the second house. And what we're doing in this is based on a very fundamental principle of mysticism. It is called the principle of analogy. And sometimes the principle of analogy is called the Hermetic axiom. And it's from the first stated by the famous Egyptian alchemical teacher called Hermes Trismegistus. And it goes, as above, so below. What has gone before in heaven will follow after on earth. Know this and rejoice. The universal spirit is that. It's universal. It is one thing. But within itself, it produces different worlds. Different worlds going from states of spirituality beyond our current comprehension right down to this stuff. And the idea of the creation, that is the truth that is from the Creator or the creative being, that unity of truth is carried through each plane or is carried through each world analogously, so that each world has its own laws and it has its own properties and it has its own purpose. But still, the same universal truth carries through it by analogy. And this is very, very important. The better you can analogize, the better your spiritual life is. Years ago, I discovered that if I could form good analogies, that meant I was in a good spiritual place. And then in the last year or two, I read that this is something that all mystics do, that they determine the character of their spiritual development according to how well they can analogize. Now, in astrology, there are 3 levels of analogy. One is the constellations. The next is the signs, and the next is the houses. You could even say that there's a deeper crystallization of the signs into the planets, but we don't want to carry things that far. Now, the constellations are made of fixed stars, and the fixed stars are the external bodies of great spiritual beings. And they emanate the truth and the creative work that is an expression of their very spiritual being as light. It is spiritual light, but it carries as far as being physical light. Even fixed stars do have direct effect in astrology. Now, if you're looking at them from a given place in space, collections of fixed stars, their light gathers together, and those are the constellations. Of course, that same star might be affecting other constellations in other parts of space. But the whole idea is that it is a very lofty spiritual expression. We as humans can't really understand it. It is so far beyond us. We can see the light and it has effect on us, but for us to understand it would be something parallel to looking at the sun from as close as you could get directly into it with your eyes. You'd be burned up. You can't do it. Now, the constellations, as they are seen from a given place in space, like our solar system, because relative to the fixed stars, our solar system is just a dot. And that dot that is our solar system, which is our field of evolution, the constellations are formed in a geometric pattern. We're not going to go into that because it's something that would take us too far from where we want to go. But the famous Neoplatonistic astrologer and mystic Porphyry once said the zodiac existed before there were stars. Meaning to say the idea that is manifest as a constellation or as a zodiac, that idea was there before there was a manifestation in the stars. Now, from the constellations, locally in our solar system, the ideas of the sidereal constellational zodiac become manifest as signs in what is called the tropical zodiac. And the signs are local things, local to our solar system. And the signs are themselves embodied by angels and archangels and all sorts of spiritual hierarchies. Everything is alive, and nothing. The idea that there's just empty space and things are happening on the planet Earth is facetious. Everything on every level of our being, there is an interpenetration between spiritual worlds and the beings that comprise those spiritual worlds. So the signs of the zodiac are emanations from creative hierarchies. And we don't usually understand them that way. Sometimes mystics can do that. Some of them that can see into the signs of the zodiac can experience directly what is being emanated by the different spiritual hierarchies. But what we understand them by is ideas, very complex ideas. Now, the third level of analogy is how the signs and constellations are seen from a given place on Earth at a given time. Things are divided into a wheel, just like they are divided into a wheel that is the signs and that is the constellations. But the houses are called mundane houses because they relate to mundane experiences, the things that we need here in this physical world in order to go forward in our evolution and take part in the very purposeful creation that we belong to. Now, so what we can see then is that there is an analogy between the constellations and the signs and the houses. And so when we're trying to get to the second house, so what we're going to look at is the second house relative to the second sign, which again is Taurus. Now, Taurus is ruled by Venus. It means that the character of Venus is epitomal, an epitomal expression of the character of Taurus. And the rulership works both ways, that the planet, whatever happens to the planet affects the sign, and whatever happens in the sign affects the planet. So Venus, we could say, is an abstract ruler of the second house. But that's only abstract. It isn't the actual ruler or the factual ruler unless one of the Venusian signs is on the cusp of the second house. If Libra is on the cusp of the second house or Taurus is on the cusp of the second house, then Venus becomes the actual ruler of the second house. All right. The second house, well, Taurus is a fixed earth sign. And Taurus is the first of the earth signs as we go around the zodiac. Now, in spiritual symbology, fire represents spirit, and earth represents matter. So, being the first earth sign, Taurus represents the most basic material state of matter. So, the second house represents opportunities for understanding matter as it is. Now, for most people, this means the kind of matter that they need for their material experience. And for most people, that's income. So that if you look at the old-fashioned wheels, the second house is money. But for us, it's just the necessary income for material experience. Now, for some, if you have Jupiter in Sagittarius in the second house, the understanding of the needs might be abstract, or it might be quite philosophically, but nonetheless, it relates to the fundamental earthly needs. Now, Venus is the abstract ruler of the second house, and it is a planet of art, and it is a planet of beauty. Now, this doesn't mean that the second house is a house of art. It rather means something like quality. Taurus is a sign that likes high quality. If it's going to buy clothing, it's going to buy the best quality clothing, or if it's going to buy a tool, it's going to want the top quality tool. I have a friend who has Taurus on the cusp of the second house, and I was going to buy an electric screwdriver, a portable electric screwdriver, and he automatically directed to me to something where the screwdriver costs $150. That's how it goes like that. Now, the quality is not merely the need for quality, but it has to be found in the stuff itself. For an example, if you have Gemini in the cusp of the second house, it indicates the kind of quality of intellectual needs that a person has. In the world, when we find things of quality, Venusian quality, the better the quality is, the more precious it is. And therefore, the second house is the evaluation of the things that you need. So, the second house can, if you're having to deal with matter, it deals with the density of the matter or the texture or other qualities of the stuff that we need to make manifest what we're trying to make manifest. Now, these things sort of merge in practical examples. About 30 years ago, I worked with a man who had a horoscope where the second house was loaded with Aquarian influences. And we started interacting together and working with his horoscope. And in the course of our interaction, it came out that he was in and was intended to be in a field of electricity. He was, in fact, an electrician. But because everything was in the second house, it turned out that his strength and the way that he could do best in that work was as an estimator, because he could evaluate what materials would be needed to accomplish a given wiring scheme, and he knew what, he could be quite accurate. And so that is a manifestation of how that works with the second house. All right. We're going to be out of here in less than an hour, I believe. Bob says, I don't believe it. Venus is the planet of love. And with love is how we are attracted to each other. Show me a person who loves a lot, and I'll show you someone who attracts all sorts of other people around. So when we take the Venus quality in abstract and translate it into the second house, that attraction becomes the quality of accumulation. How and how much and what we accumulate is what is indicated by the second house. So the second house indicates income. It indicates just simple things like wages, but on a grander scale, it can indicate capitalization. Now, sometimes we attract in ways that seem to go beyond needs, and the second house can be like that. That is when a person becomes a collector, and collectors become fascinated with trying to get the whole collection or get the whole set of things. So the concept of the second house then is a collector. I have a brother who is many ways Taurus, and he's a big-time collector. He collects stamps, and he collects audio cassette tapes. Now it's in CDs. And at one time, I get these manias, and I had a mania for an old-time hymn called Just a Closer Walk with Thee. And I was visiting him, and he had these 2 mint cassette tapes of different bands in New Orleans that had Just a Closer Walk with Thee. And I wanted to loan them so I could put them in part of a collection. No way that was going to happen. He changed the subject, and I never saw those tapes again in my life. He allowed me to look at the cassette box, and it went no further than that. All right. So when you collect, in terms of physics, the notion of a collection of something in its density is called mass. And mass is a idea that is shared by both Taurus and the second house. And this works out in different ways. It works out that, if you collect a lot of things and you have to move, you see how much you are weighed down. And so the second house often represents the things that weigh us down and that burden us. So the second house being a house of necessity, we have to determine what is necessary and what isn't necessary for material continuance. It's basic. Fixed earth, which is what Taurus is bedrock. And the second house is the unbudgeable, unchangeable things that materially we have to produce or that we need to fulfill ourselves. All right, now let's shift gears and do something very different. Beside the houses being concretions or abstractions from the signs, depending on a point of view, there are other ways of understanding the houses. And deriving the houses from the signs is a vertical means of understanding. The principle of analogy is a vertical principle because it's as above, so below. There are horizontal means of understanding. The way unity is maintained in the horizontal is in the principle of cause and consequence. There are 2 sides of equal value in any kind of transaction within any world of existence. In this, you view each of the houses as being equal with each of the other houses. In the horizontal, everything is equal. So now we're going to do a little bit of that with the second house. Now the simplest way to do this, to relate the second house to one other house, is there are 2 ways that can be done, and we'll look at both of them. Viewing the houses as equal means that they're equal. Now, one way of comparing one house to another is comparing adjacent houses. Taurus, or the second house, is adjacent to the first house, and it is adjacent to the third house. And if we can compare and contrast between 2 signs or the causal connection between 2 houses, we can come to an understanding of those 2 houses. Now, before we do that, let's go right back to the beginning of the zodiac. The beginning of the zodiac is the vernal point. And Aries is considered the first sign. And Pisces is considered the last sign. We're going to look at the relationship of Aries to Pisces so that we can understand the relationship of Taurus to Aries. We could do the same thing relating Taurus to Gemini, but that's too much and it would get a little too tedious for what we're trying to get at. Aries is the start of the zodiac, and Pisces is the end. That is, if we look at the zodiac as represented by matter. If we look at, or space, if we look at the zodiac relative to time, the beginning of the zodiac is at the cusp of Capricorn. But that's a very esoteric subject, and it has to do with the early Saturn period and things like that, and that's way beyond what we're trying to do. So this is the vernal point, the point that is when the sun is exactly on the equator. If we proceed clockwise through the zodiac or through the horoscope, that is from the start of it up through Taurus and Aquarius and then Capricorn, if you go clockwise, that is going backward in time. If you go counterclockwise, it is going forward in time, whether it's on the zodiac or whether it's in the houses of the horoscope. The beginning, the now point, is right at the cusp of the first house or at the cusp of Aries. So, going backwards represents the past, and going forward represents the future, as things always progress or project themselves forward more strongly than they do backward. Now, the relationship of the 12th house to the first house is the past conditions that indicate present circumstances. So the relationship of these two houses is that one is the past and this is the present leading toward the future. Now the trick of it is you have to understand intuitively. How far past? Is it a past life? Because the 12th house usually indicates conditions from past lives that are ripe, that need to be fulfilled in this life, and when things pop into the first house is when that happens. But going backward in time can be done in a different way. It can be very much closer. I once worked with a young woman that had a terrible, terrible neurotic character, and the neurotic character was because her father hated her. And her father hated her because at the time that her mother became impregnated by her father was just when he was going to enter into law school and have a career being a lawyer. And when she came along, he couldn't do that, and he had to take a job, and he never had the glorious career that he wanted to have. So she had Saturn conjoined the ascendant, so there was that hateful presence there, but it was just above the ascendant, indicating that it was something that happened just before the time of birth. So the relationship of the 12th house to the first house is something that can be transplanted to any house. So the second house is, let's say it the other way around. The first house is the 12th house of the second house. So the first house is the past of the present condition, material condition. And in the zodiac, the actions that we take, the primary actions that we take are indicated by Aries. And the responsibilities that accrue to those basic actions are what are indicated by Taurus. So we can see that the second house is like that. it is, you can see it as rewards, or you can see it as duties, and the rewards and duties are relative to what is indicated by the first house. Very good way of understanding life and the material circumstances of life in a way that makes sense relative to a past life as well as the past in this life. So, when the lessons of life are brought down to the material level, they become obvious and they become indubitable. They are what they are. You know, this stuff is what it is, and you can't make it be what it isn't. And that's the way the second house is. You have to have income to pay the bills. There are a lot of people now that would like to go and live off the land and live off the grid, but you can't do it anymore. Because you have to somehow deal with the rest of society, because you have to be able to pay taxes for the land that you're on. And so you are a part of society, and you are integrated into society whether you like it or not. So the second house represents object lessons that we gain through responsibilities, and those responsibilities are usually have something to do with stuff or matter or things like that. So the active causes of Aries they can't outrun the concrete consequences of Taurus. So the second house then can be seen as the deposits from actions. Things accrue to actions. If you put a vector forward, it attracts things to it, and that accrual is what the second house is like. So this is the house of deposits. First house is personal actions, and the second house is personal expenses. So all of these things are tied together in this abstract kind of view of time. All right. It's going to be just under an hour, I think. Now let's look at the other way of comparing one house to one other single house. And this presents us with a very tiny dilemma, because last spring we already familiarized ourselves with the first house. We didn't do a great job of it, but we did familiarize ourselves. Now we're beginning to work with the second house, and we're wanting to look at the second house relative to the opposite house, which is the eighth house. But the little bugaboo is that we haven't looked at the eighth house yet. So, so what we're going to have to do to get around this is we're going to take one or two very simple concepts, just making them as statements about the eighth house, and use them to understand the second house better. Now, if you look at one of those wheels, ancient wheels like you find in old textbooks, astrology textbooks, we said that the word that is most commonly, if there's a one word for each of the houses, the word for the second house is money. Well, for the eighth house, it is almost always death. Now, if you're not careful about this, you might think that the opposite of death is life. But the second house is not life. Even though materialists would like to say you don't live unless you have money, the second house is not life. It doesn't work that way. Opposites in astrology are not always contrary to each other. And they're not antagonistic, and they're not conflicting. They can be sometimes. But most often, they are complementary. So if we look at death in a different way than just seeing it as a cessation of vital life here on earth, we can come to a better understanding. Let's introduce another eighth house keyword: secrets. Most often secrets are secrets because they're hidden. they're unseen, or they're not disclosed. And this ties together with death. Death is a secret because we can't see the departed. At least most people can't. Only a few dreamers and a few visionaries can, but most people can't see the dead. So with death, the one that we loved is absent. And that's the word we're looking for. Absence. The opposite of absence is presence. The second house is all about presence. There are some things that we learn best by owning them or possessing them. They often, they often possess us, but that's a truism that everybody knows about. When we own something, it is our responsibility. It has to be taken care of, or it has to be secured, or if you move around, it has to be hauled around. Now, there are all sorts of sayings in folk language that illustrate this facet of the second house. If you're playing poker with somebody and they have called your hand, you say, "Show me what you have." Meaning to say what you have is an indication of that's what you stand for. Or in law, they usually say that possession is 9/10 of the law. So how much money somebody earns or how much someone owns is often the means of determining their worth. We have a term for that we judge people by. We call it, what's their net worth? And when we're talking about that, we're not talking about friendship. We're not talking about idealism. We're not talking about companionship. We're talking about the second house. The person's net worth is how much that they have present around them. All of these are examples of what the second house is like. Now, our existence here in this chemical subdivision of the physical world is of fundamental importance. The lessons that we learn here, and this is the only place we can really learn lessons, are elementary, but they're fundamental. They're fundamental for our entire evolutionary future. Our future is in the spiritual worlds. And knowing this, we realize that this world is extremely limiting. In our inner nature, we're spiritual. And we find it frustrating that there are all of these conditions that hold us back. We really want to go flying around in the inner worlds. And we can do things in our mind, and it's really easy to do them in our mind, but to carry them out here in the physical world is not easy. They require a Tarian kind of patience. Now, the value of limitations lies in the fact that they produce a simple, objective environment. In the inner worlds, there are so many things going on, and there are so many sides to everything that you can be distracted, and you can become lost and confused and carried away before you realize it. Sometimes you just even turn inwardly without a full clairvoyance or anything like that, and things start happening, and before you know it, you're way off from where you wanted to go in the first place. But here, objects are indubitable realities, sometimes stubbornly indubitable. I learned that. I have a Neptune conjoined the ascendant, and sometimes I get so otherworldly. Twice I have walked into lampposts in my life. And when that happens, you understand the indubitability of the world quite quickly. if we have something like a big cardboard box, like a laundromat or something like that comes in it, if we're looking at it, we're usually facing it, we can only see one side of it. In a desire world, you can see all of the different sides at the same time. Now that's a limitation, to see only one side, especially when it is opaque. But that limitation is objective. We can measure it, and we can determine its relationship to other objects, and we can look at it three-dimensionally, and we can do all sorts of things with it, and we come to a very objective understanding. And that simple objectivity that we learn here in this world, that becomes part of our character. That becomes part of our consciousness and how we look at things. And then, when we enter into higher spiritual worlds, we can transplant and we can expand that objectivity. But if we disdain learning the objectivity of this physical world, it's not going to help us in the least when we go into the inner worlds. All right. There's a whole lot more that could be said about presence versus absence, but this should be enough. This, as always, these are just introductions, and it's up to you to ponder these things, because when you run into a horoscope, that first horoscope is going to be like a piece of toilet paper. You're going to look at it, and you're not going to know what a person's life is all about. But if you can, you're going to have to ponder what its meaning is, and that causes you to ponder what the houses mean. All right. So we have looked at one house relative to one other house in two different ways. We've looked at it in adjacence, and we have looked at it in terms of opposites. Now, we want to look at one house relative to two other houses. And that's usually done with symmetry, because in symmetry we can get an idea of the whole in balanced antipodals. Now we could go into the spiritual mathematics of that, but that would again take us too far afield. When we look at one house relative to two other houses symmetrically, there are two ways that this can be done. And we're going to look at one of them this evening, and this other one we're going to use to lead off the next time we meet in 2 weeks. Now, I know this is going extremely slowly. I hope you're getting a thorough idea, and I hope you're being able to put all these things together to produce one idea of the second house that you can see it has all of these different facets and characteristics to it, because that'll be helpful to you when you start doing horoscopes. All right. So don't be discouraged. This is tedious. When we come to the other houses, the 3rd, 4th, and 5th, we'll be able to do all of this in one short talk, because we'll have laid this groundwork. Now, let's begin where we just left off. We looked at the 8th house relative to the 2nd house. Well, the 8th house relates to the 8th sign, Scorpio. And well, that's a water sign. And Taurus is the 2nd sign that relates to the 2nd house, and that's an earth sign. Now, water and earth are said in astrological parlance to be complementary elements. They are said to be negative or receptive or relatively passive elements. The positive elements, fire and air, which are also complementary, are positive in that they are more projecting and activating than they are receptive. Find somebody that's got everything in fire, you find somebody that isn't very receptive at all. They're radiating so much, there's no time to be receptive. So this, we see this in nature. Fire moves air. Did any of you see that picture on the internet of that tornado, the fire tornado in British Columbia? were hundreds of feet in the air. The flame went up because it was part of, that's an example of fire moving air. And air moves water. And water either moves or wears on earth. So we can see in this that the fire and air are much more active. And the water, and especially the earth, are much more passive. They're much more receptive. They receive the energy from the other elements. Now this is really important in astrology because complementary ascendants get along way better than non-complementary ascendants. And this is important especially in sustained intimate relationships like marriage. And it is even more especially important when children are to be produced from that type of a marriage, that's the type of a sustained relationship. If you have a positive parent and a negative, we're talking about ascendants, a positive parent, one parent is positive and one parent is negative, there's something there that it's more difficult to have perfectly healthy children. I had an incident a few years ago that this woman came to me and said that she had had this relationship ongoing out with this man for 20 years and he wasn't ready to budge. And I said, well, it's probably a good thing that because you're not really highly compatible with each other. And so she left town, and then he finally decided to make up his mind that he wanted to get married, and he had to go out of town to court her. And because he went so far, they did get married. And they both, of course, hated me for having said that they weren't compatible. And I didn't dare tell them that their children, all of whom didn't have major birth defects, but all of them had health problems because of that. I didn't dare tell them that because it would have been too much. Yes?
So it's because they had the 2 positive or 2 negative signs?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. All right. So we can see that the earth sign house, the second house, is complementary with the 2 water sign houses, Pisces and Cancer. There is a sextile complementation of earth with water, just like there is a complementation of earth with water in the opposite of Scorpio and Taurus. So, the 4th, the 8th, and the 12th houses are often called mysteries houses because, among other things, they represent opportunities to experience and work in the invisible worlds. Just the opportunities. The capacities are indicated elsewhere in the horoscope. And because these houses relate to invisible things, they're difficult houses to understand. An astrologer may understand that there's something that is secret, but exactly what the secret is and how it is or why it is not easy. Even with the horoscope, it's hard to understand the hidden things. Beside being hidden to our earthly vision, the inner worlds are also extremely subtle, and they're extremely elusive. It's, one thought changes your whole environment in the inner worlds. It's a powerful thing. So in the inner worlds, everything is moving, and everything is changing, and it's all going on simultaneously and continuously. And as a result, a lot of interrelationships are constantly changing. Now, Archimedes said, give me a place to stand and a long enough lever, and I can move the earth. The place to stand is anchorage, is firm ground. The second house, relative in complementation to the 4th and the 12th houses, represents anchorage. It represents the ability to be down to earth. It represents stability. You know, this is what this is what gets mediums into trouble. They can't pay the bills, so they start faking it and doing things of that nature. But so the second house then gives the stability, even if it means you have to go to work every day. And it gives stability in the face of very subtle things, very will-o'-the-wisp kinds of things in life. Okay, now there's a whole lot more that could be said about that, but it's already, we've gone long enough. It's just about exactly an hour. And again, this leaves you something more for independent thought. And that's as far as we're going to go tonight. You look like you have a question.
Well, I've got a comment.
Okay.
I don't do a lot of reading, but
Uh-huh.
I read this, an arcane definition of death is change.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at it from the point of view that Taurus is almost the most unchanging sign, that
Yes.
would make
Yep.
Scorpio
Yep.
the exact opposite.
Yeah,
You know?
yeah. Change your state. Change your state, yeah.
So,
Good insight. Any questions? Thank you very much. Next week is a mysticism talk, so, and we get this. Finally, we get to second heaven next week. Joanna is familiar with how tedious and slow I am with everything.